The shadow of separatism is upon us again in Canada, except this time it's coming from the west instead of the east. Does the Alberta separatist movement pose a real threat to national unity, or is it just a small minority of vocal supporters? There is no question the movement is in the spotlight thanks to President Trump, but could it just be a blip on the political radar? Join us as we unpack the spin on Alberta separatism. Welcome to Spin Nation. So here we are on episode 21 of Spin Nation, and Alberta separatism is on the docket. And Emmanuel, it's a nice treat that we have a guest with us today.
Our second guest on the podcast.
That's
Welcome.
Right. And actually the first guest I'm not, yeah, and you're the first one I'm not related to. So this is an extra special welcome. So for those who don't know, Kim King is the president and founder of King Strategies. She has deep expertise and knowledge of the Alberta political climate. She's worked in both the public and private sectors, including under the Klein administration. You are coming to us from Edmonton, where you now advise clients on how to navigate politics and government across Western Canada. Kim, we're so excited that you are joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
I think for a topic like this, we have the full spectrum of separatism. Emmanuel coming from Quebec. Kim, you're coming from Alberta. We're going to have a full conversation about how separatism has grown up on both sides of the country.
Thank you for having me. And I actually recently had a good friend from Montreal visit me at my cabin, which is the same as a cottage, but in the West we call them cabin, this summer. And it was so interesting for me to see his reaction to all of the Canadian flags he saw around the lake that day, that he was not expecting it. And I think this is like an interesting point of why we're here today.
Well, that's funny because when we went to visit Emmanuel's mother in Ile Perrot, it was soon after Canada Day, and it's in Quebec, but there were quite a few Canadian flags up around as well. I remember commenting. Is there some new Canadian nationalism, Emmanuel, in Quebec?
I think we can thank Donald Trump for a lot of that. I put up my first Canadian flag this year, and it was a direct reaction and message back to south of the border.
Yes, and definitely on this topic, President Trump has had a real impact. And our business question of today is this threat of Alberta separatism real? And Kim, I have to admit, I didn't even know this was a thing in Alberta until President Trump made his 51st state comments. And then we saw on social all this talk about Alberta separatism. So to kick us off, can you share, is this a new thing? Has this been around a long time? Maybe a little bit of context for the listeners, especially those of us in Eastern Canada who have no clue.
Sure. Yeah, it's been around for decades. And it's really been this sense of fairness, of is Alberta getting its fair share from Ottawa? And I would say that it's interesting to see the bump that's happened post-Trump comments on the 51st state, to see some Albertans putting on MAGA hats and wearing T-shirts that say, we want to be the 51st state. But I think the truth is definitely significantly different than those snapshots of individuals in time, and whether or not this is really a larger sentiment of fairness and perhaps a negotiation tactic instead of a true interest in separation from the majority.
I've kind of wondered about that is Premier Smith, I mean, she's definitely leveraging it to her advantage in terms of negotiating with Ottawa. But I have wondered if this isn't going to bite her in the butt in the future. I'm curious, maybe from what you're hearing on if that's how people see it.
Sure. There's a narrative around why this is even happening. Why is there so much air being given to this conversation? And whether or not that is around the further right contingent of what is supposed to be the United Conservative Big Tent Party, and keeping that further right contingent satisfied, happy, and heard within the UC party. Because the risk is, of course, is that those individuals decide to leave. And there are some pop-up parties that have been created around that sentiment already. Recently, two further right-wing and more separatist movement parties ran candidates in a by-election in an area called Old Didsbury. And a lot of people were watching to see what happened in that by-election. It was just this spring, it was just in June, and neither party fared well, with the United Conservative Party pulling in 61% of the vote. So if you're watching that riding, and particularly that riding because it is the only riding that has ever elected a separatist MLA back in the 80s. So again, has this been happening for a long time? Yes, back in the 80s, there was a separatist MLA in the legislature. But today, this June, the United Conservative Party handedly took that riding.
And for sure, using this separation conversation as a negotiating tool, that was fairly big part of the 1995 referendum. That's the one I was, adult and able to analyze. I'm not 100% sure for 1980, but that was part of the equation when you were thinking about your vote. Is if we go, up to a certain level, this just gives us leverage with Ottawa. But the danger is if we go above, 50 plus one, then suddenly we have no idea what comes next.
Isn't that what happened with the UK and Brexit?
It kind of fell the other side, yeah.
Okay, I think that example that this riding, the separatists did not come out ahead. That's an important data point, and one, quite frankly, that we're not hearing about in the rest of Canada. So what we're hearing is what is the media latching onto, and I admit, Emmanuel and I are we're also guilty of this because we did a big analysis on the 51st state, and that's when we were like, oh, look at this whole separatist conversation, red flag, red flag. Is it a red flag? So if our business question is around, like, is this Alberta separatist movement, is there a real risk that could happen? I'd love to get your perspective as someone on the ground. That does it have the momentum or not?
Emmanuel, you mentioned the referendum in 1995. There was a rally in Quebec in 1995 that had over 100,000 people at it, right? 100,000 people. There have been two rallies in Alberta at the legislature around separation, and the most generous estimate that I could find of how many people attended was 150. So I do think that there's perception and then there's reality. I think there is definitely reality in that Albertans feel disenfranchised, right? That there have been major federal decisions like pipeline rejections, tanker bans, carbon taxes that hurt our economy. And then our economy is what is sending hundreds of billions of dollars in transfer fees to Ottawa, of which then we don't get any back. I think that sentiment is definitely more popular than let's leave. It's actually like a red herring to a larger conversation, because when you start talking about separating, people are like, well, that's ridiculous, because what about the currency? What about your passport? What about the bank system and all these things that are like, what about interprovincial trade? We actually depend on that too. So it becomes a conversation that takes a lot of air and oxygen and time that actually isn't what most people care about. So there's also legislation that has been passed around protecting provincial autonomy. So how do we protect from federal overreach? So that's definitely like another narrative for sure.
And that in Quebec was a big part of the conversation, of course. But over the years, there's been carve-outs for language and a number of other areas where Quebec has a little more negotiating room than the rest of the provinces.
Right. So I do think this is an interesting conversation. Actually, I remember when Quebec instituted $5 a day daycare. And we didn't have it here, and I was a young mom, and I thought, like, how is this happening? How can we not afford it in Alberta, and Quebec can afford it with our massive transfers? So it kind of feeds that discontent. But again, I do think it's more around fairness and a better deal than truly any major support at all for actually separating.
Definitely the transfer payments has been a conversation in Quebec for a long time. Quebec is a different province because depending on the decade, if Quebec would have separated, I think at the time that would have created quite the deficit situation for Quebec.
So when we looked at the data, like so talking about narratives, we did pull up some data on it. And as we talked in the beginning, obviously Trump had a massive impact back in April with his 51st state mention. And coming off of that, we saw this bump up in Alberta separatism. So there's no denying the influence Trump has had. What I'm curious about is for those people who are interested in the 51st state, it's not the same thing as Alberta sovereignty.
Right.
Right. Joining another country is not being a sovereign nation. It's joining another country. So do people distinguish between those two when they talk about it locally in Alberta? Because I think here we get a little bit confused between them.
I actually don't think people are talking about it that much. So it's hard for me to say amongst the people who are talking about it, which one would you rather? I would say that literally before he said 51st state, 0.01% of people were considering that Alberta would be the 51st state. Then he said it, and then it becomes like, oh, well, I guess if we were to separate, now we have someone who would take us under their wing. I really do believe if you look at the representation of NDP in the legislature right now, a very significant representation. The urban centers are all going with left-leaning, candidates, right? As evidenced by this most recent by-election, is still pretty supportive of the United Conservative Party and a more fiscally conservative but socially, compassionate approach to governing.
It does feel like there's a dichotomy happening because you've had like the NDP, wasn't he mayor of Calgary before that?
Yeah,
Mayor Nenshi.
that's right.
Nenshi, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
you wouldn't
he'll be
think,
walking into the legislature for the first time. He'll be walking into the legislature here next week when they go back into session. So it'll be an interesting session. We also have the second week underway of a full teachers strike. They walked out. I don't know if that's hit the news out there.
Yes,
but it's
that we had seen.
Yes. So not a lot of people talking about separating right now. A lot of people talking about when do the kids go back to school.
So again, the issues that actually impact people's lives on the day-to-day is what they really care about, not as much these political games that are being played.
Yeah. And I think, again, when you tie it back to the economy, right? So when there's an economic downturn in Alberta, we still pay the federal transfers and still do not get back any money out of the transfers because we are that much more of an economic driver than any other relative province who is probably also in some kind of economic downturn, right? So, but when you talk about that, what does that mean for families? Like, what does that mean for the individuals that are driving and flying into Fort McMurray and working 10 days on, 6 days off in the oil sands who now don't have jobs? A lot of Albertans came from elsewhere for work, for jobs, to work in the oil and gas sector, for the opportunity that Alberta presented to them. And if that starts to feel like that's getting squashed or not enabled by your Canadian government. The fairness hits home.
And I think this, what you just said, speaks to how social media algorithms take the more partisan conversation, the more controversial topics, and blow them out of proportion to the everyday conversation. And so you only see, from our end, outside of Alberta, we see this, what looks like this really heated debate, because we're seeing the left side of the tail and the right side of the tail of this bell curve. And we kind of lose track of the everyday conversation, which is, you know what, we just want to make ends meet, get our families fed, and have a good life.
Right. It's worth mentioning too that Alberta does have the youngest population, and with that comes a lot of cost, right? In the sense of you need new schools, you need new roads, you need new hospitals, you need, like, you're growing and it's a young population, you need that infrastructure. So I think that's also probably where some of this recalculation on the deal needs to come into play.
Well, I have to say you are putting my concerns to rest with your on the ground perspective that the separatist conversation, while there and while rooted in some real deep concerns about equity and fairness, that needs to be addressed. And I think you have a very strong premier from that point of view who has absolutely got the attention of Ottawa and Carney. Then
We will see. Right? We have these two petitions. We have two petitions out right now that are gathering signatures like crazy. One says, like, should we stay? Should we go? This is literally out there. So are they going to achieve the threshold of 300,000 signatures, which is way lower than what it used to be? Premier Smith did make it easier for everybody to gather this threshold of 300,000. I think it was 700,000 before. So you need those signatures to then trigger a referendum. So it'll be interesting. We'll see. Can both sides get it done? Then we're asking the question, and then we'll put it to rest, right?
That is an interesting, I'd say, strategy that Premier Smith is using to make it easier to have the conversation. And if you think about it from a, let's say, communications or stakeholder management and engagement point of view, we always recommend it's better to open the door and have the conversation and give air so people can talk about things rather than let them simmer underground until you have this big explosion and then you're dealing with it from a crisis point of view. So it is a bit more of a riskier approach. I kind of like it, though, I have to say. I like that she's taking a risk with it. Maybe as a, Eastern Canadian and very national Canadian, I don't love the fact that they're talking referendum, but purely from an engagement and communications point of view, I respect the risk that she's taking.
As an Albertan, if you want to have your voice heard, there's like no excuse. You can't sit there and say that no one asked, I wasn't asked, I didn't have an opportunity to share my opinion, because there are endless town halls. There are petitions you can sign, and it's way easier to get your voice heard. Again, every small community, medium-sized community had an open house around that. Give us your feedback. Tell us what you think. Like, there is a very purposeful grassroots engagement effort to inform the path forward, right? And I agree, like, better to ask and also know and realize, is this true or is this spin?
All right. Well, this has been very, very eye-opening for me in particular, living in the center of the universe, Toronto, and we don't really understand what's happening in other provinces as well. So, Emmanuel, how about what's your so what? Someone who actually has, lived through, I guess, technically lived through 2 referendums in Quebec.
I was 6 for the first one, but yes, I did live through it. I think this is a good example of how the algorithm amplifies stories that are at both ends and more controversial by nature. And also how this algorithm was affected by U.S. politics, right? A lot of this was launched around a statement by Trump for 51st state. We still don't know how much he was joking or not, but it was enough to launch a whole conversation here in Canada, which just shows the impact of those social media algorithms and networks on our own media ecosystem.
Kim, we always wrap this podcast episode with our so what. So let me give it to you as our guest. What is your so what with what you've seen from some of the data that we've shared? What is your guidance to your clients, as an example, who are coming to you with this very question around Alberta separatism and how to navigate it? All right, Kim, go for it.
I would say the so what is the sense of lack of fairness in Alberta amongst Albertans, as it relates to our relationship with Ottawa, is very real. But that any conversation around separating is a red herring and a distraction from the true conversation that should be happening around how Ottawa can and the rest of Canada support the Alberta economy and acknowledge the contributions that the Alberta economy does make to the rest of Canada, and really what that fair deal looks like.
Excellent. So for my so what, I'm gonna bring us up a bit higher into more of a global perspective, and the reason I want to do that in the context of this Alberta separatism discussion is if Canada under Carney is really pushing for this new, more global, new trade partners, and we're going to be doing so much more investment, and we need to bring in private sector investment. Any conversation domestically around separation is just going to spook investors, because they're like, well, how real is this? And do I want to be investing in Alberta pipelines if maybe this province is going to separate in 10 years from now? And then what's going to happen to my investment if I made the deal with the Canadian government? So I'm just looking at it from that perspective, that to both of your points, that if the underlying issue is real, how people feel is real, but the separatism itself is not that prominent, by the fact that the algorithms and the media and the politicians are hyping it up, for investors from other parts of Canada, investors from other parts of the world, if they're hearing it, it might make them less inclined to invest in Canada because there's this political risk that they don't understand. So it doesn't help anybody to maintain this conversation. I know we're guilty because we're talking about it here on the podcast, but I'm hoping that at least this podcast is lifting the spin to help our listeners at least understand that this is not something that's materializing anytime soon. And hopefully between Premier Smith and Prime Minister Carney, who seem to have a good relationship, they can work out some of these fairness issues that you've been so eloquently highlighting, Kim.
And I'll speak to that in that Montreal in the 60s and 70s was the leading economic center of Canada. And that slowly shifted to Toronto during this whole separation conversation we had in the 70s and 80s. So definitely a danger and something of concern for investors and big companies.
So hopefully people will learn from history. All right. Well, this has been so great. I think having you on with us to talk about it, Kim, absolutely added so much richness to the discussion, because we missed so much because we did not understand the local context. So thank you so much for joining us and bringing your perspective and experience. This was great.
Well, maybe next time that we can film this in July at the Calgary Stampede, and you can, be live on the streets, gathering the input of the Calgarians and how they feel.
We'll do streeters.
Yes, with cowboy hats on.
That's right. Every Torontonian I know who goes to Stampede has to go out and they buy their fresh, brand new cowboy hat and boots. I always kind of
you have to. And then they get here and they realize they should have bought a belt. There's always more. Yeah. There's always one more thing and a bolo tie. You need all the things.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. And as always, we will see you next time.
Great. Thank you.